So, William Landay, the author of the best-selling novel on which Defending Jacob is based, said that a question came up as they were trying to figure out how to end the story. And the question was how that you end the story in a way that was both big enough to be dramatically satisfying, yet small enough to be credible for the ordinary people who populate the book. Well, they figured it out. Wow, that was a ride. I am going to get into my thoughts on the season. Well, I guess it's the finale because I don't think they're going to make a second season of this, but on the finale of Defending Jacob, episode 8, entitled After, very fittingly, as that's been a theme of this series. And I'll start off by giving my thoughts off the top without spoilers, and then I'll go into spoilers after I give you a warning. So before I do that, though, if you're new to the channel, if you're interested in watching my videos as I put them out on a weekly basis, I highly recommend subscribing. Do you know, and this is something really interesting to me, 95% of you watch my videos and don't subscribe? That just, that hurts me. Anyway, I really liked this episode, and a big question for me going into this was, how could this be satisfying? Because we've had 6 weeks of build up to this since the initial 3 episodes that they released, and to me it was like, how is this ending going to define the series? Because it's the type of series where you really need an ending, and it was great. In my opinion, this ending was so good, and I had the book spoiled for me in the comments section of one of my videos, but thankfully the show, if you've read the book, the show does a few things differently, and I think that was a good decision, and I think that it actually ironed out some of the themes of the story. I've given some criticism to Chris Evans throughout this series. He deserves whatever they paid him for this, and an Emmy nomination. He was great here. This was truly, to me, his episode, although other actors gave strong performances as well, particularly Michelle Dockery, who I've always singled out for praise, but I really felt like Chris Evans had a strong episode. And I felt like they really managed to pull off what Landy described, which was that they had to find a way to end it that was big enough to be dramatically satisfying, but that was consistent with who these characters have been, and I think they really pulled that off. It was surprisingly dark. I'm surprised at their willingness to go there, and it's less dark than the book, thankfully. I'm not sure if I could have lived with the ending from the book, but it's still very dark. And if you were expecting them to pull back, because this was it seemed like a mainstream show because of Chris Evans and Michelle Dockery and Jaeden Martell, if you expected that to happen, be prepared. This is a really dark ending. So now I'm going to go into my thoughts with spoilers. So if you don't want spoilers and you haven't seen the episode yet, come back and hear what I had to say with spoilers later. So getting into this episode. At the beginning of this episode, I just felt really excited because I was like, this is it. This is the wrap up. And I don't know if you could have accomplished that without having released this on a weekly basis. I've complained a lot about how releasing this on a weekly basis kind of diluted my enthusiasm for this, but I feel like having all this time where I had to watch it a week at a time and had to feel impatient and had to really want the resolution made this episode feel like a big event. And having high expectations can sometimes really keep you from enjoying something, but I have to say here, it really just made me appreciate it. Now, the episode starts off kind of abruptly with the news that Pats has committed suicide and he confessed, and they're dismissing the case against Jacob. And to me, this was odd because the dismissal, like the same evidence exists that Jacob committed the crime as there was before. The only difference is that someone else has confessed. So to me, like, this dismissal shows how flimsy the evidence was against him, that it didn't actually prove his guilt. And I'm just super confused. Like, what about reasonable doubt do people not understand? Like, if you could have someone confess to the crime and prove that he's not guilty, theoretically, then there clearly was room for reasonable doubt, and you shouldn't have convicted him in the first place. But I digress. So the episode starts out this way, and it's obvious right from the get-go that this won't last. And it was this point, I already kind of had this spoiled, but it becomes really obvious that maybe Jacob did it, because if he's been pronounced innocent so quickly, then there's got to be more to it. And of course, we have the reveal this episode, as I predicted, that the guy who's been mysteriously lurking around and shadowing Lori turns out to be a friend of Andy's father. And he says, anything for old Billy. And at that moment, I'd already had this spoiled, but it was glaringly obvious, I feel like, to most people what had happened. And it doesn't take very long for Andy to deduce it, that, Billy had this person go and frame Pats to protect the son. But the episode takes a little bit of time here just to let them enjoy, being set free from this trial now that they can, go about their lives again. But the show shows really well, and this goes to the episode's title, how nothing can really be the same. It takes the time to portray how their lives are just different now. They're eating at a restaurant, and they can't, sit there and just eat without wondering if that person over there or that person over there is thinking about them. But all of this culminates in Andy going to talk to his father when he realizes what perhaps might have happened, because he realizes that William might have had this guy go and frame Pats and murder him. And it was an interesting scene because I felt like it finally rammed home the fact that William really is Andy's father, and it kind of drew parallels between their behavior throughout the series. And William said this really important line: you can be a good man or a good father. You get to choose. And it's interesting because William, essentially says, I don't care if Jacob did it. I would defend him no matter what. And it was interesting because Andy immediately goes and talks to Lori, and they, have their conversation, and he's sitting there, and once again, he has secrets, and he's not telling her, and the secrets that he's kept have caused a lot of trouble for them in the case. They blew up in his face last episode, and of course, now apparently he and Lori have agreed that there will be no more secrets, and yet right away he's keeping this secret that what his father did. So right away they go on a vacation to Mexico, and there were some gorgeous shots here. The cinematography throughout this show has been just, very, very slick, but I have had to question whether it really contributes to the viewer's understanding of the show. So I'm just going to talk about the fact that Hope doesn't die, and Hope obviously is this friend that Jacob meets in Mexico, and in the book she dies, and this is what pushes Lori over the edge as she comes to think that perhaps Jacob did it. And here they kind of play things out similarly, but instead of actually having Hope die, they have her turn out to be alive, which I was like, if this is the only change from what happens in the book, then they've talked up the fact that they changed the book for little to no reason. But don't worry, there were more changes from the book. This spurs Andy to reveal to Lori what he knows that his father did to defend Jacob. And it's interesting because this scene really rammed home the theme of the series to me, which is the rush to judgment. Because throughout, we as the viewer have constantly questioned what we knew and what we didn't know. And just as the jury that was trying to make a decision on Jacob's innocence or guilt questioned what they knew or didn't know. And in this moment, it's Andy finally, coming out and saying that he doesn't know if Jacob is innocent, and, because of this situation, kind of assuming that he is. And here's the thing, he doesn't know that his father had Pats framed. His father never outright said it. He said, if I did that, I did it for this reason. And it's an interesting case because I think it rams home to me how in this story, nobody ever really knew anything. We all rushed to judgment in this story, just like the characters rushed to judgment. And Andy rushed to judgment about Jacob's innocence. The jury and the judge and the court rushed to judgment about Jacob's innocence. And once again, now that Hope is missing, they rush to judgment that Jacob killed her. And it turns out that he didn't in the show, whereas in the book, she actually is dead, so maybe he did kill her. again, we don't really know that he did it. It could have been someone else. It could have been a different circumstance. But how we feel we know things is really interesting. And I think I'm going to get into this in a little bit, but what the story ultimately comes down to is that you have to be comfortable with not knowing in life, because sometimes things just aren't clear. This is where it became really interesting, because this whole season we've been watching this framing device of having Neil grilling Jacob in this courtroom. And here we finally have, we finally find out what this is, which is an inquest to try and figure out if Lori intentionally killed Jacob. And it's interesting because it didn't dawn on me until this episode what was going on. And once it did, it was like, oh, wow, that's actually, because a lot of the questions had seemed irrelevant to the murder that Jacob was accused of admitting. But once you look at them in this context, it's like, oh, no, those weren't just being done to conveniently let the viewer know how everyone was feeling during this whole time. It's actually makes sense that Neil would be asking these questions because he's trying to figure out what was going on in Lori's head and if she might have tried to kill Jacob. And I thought that this was a really interesting framing device, and it actually adds a lot to the series to know that that was what was going on the whole time. And it was interesting because we see Andy here, and we've seen him this whole time, and we've kind of known he was broken, which kind of led us to assume something bad had happened. And obviously now that Lori realizes that Pats was framed, she once again has to grapple with whether or not Jacob committed the murder. And this leads to a really Hitchcockian, very, very tense moment in the car where they start this scene out letting the viewer know exactly what's going on when they have this car kind of brush by the car, and you kind of hear the loud rush of air as it passes, and it causes you to realize what Lori is going to do. And I thought that was very well done because it creates Hitchcockian tension, because we know what Lori is thinking about doing. And if we didn't, there were other hints already, but that moment really just makes it super clear. So the subtext of this whole scene is Lori is thinking about killing them both. And it was interesting because the book makes it pretty obvious that Jacob did it, I feel. But the show kind of leaves it a lot more ambiguous in my mind. Like, I still feel like you could come to the conclusion that he did it based on the evidence that is here, but you could just as easily argue that you don't have enough evidence to show that he did it. And I think that that's where the theme of having to be comfortable with not knowing comes into play. And it comes into play in multiple ways, and I'll go through some of the other ways it comes out in a second. But this scene was really well done because it cuts between Lori and Jacob and her grilling him, and the gradual realization on Jacob's part of what's happening as he starts to become more and more tense as he realizes that his mother might actually try to kill him. And they also have Andy finding the photo album in the bin and realizing what Lori is about to do and calling frantically to try and stop her. And Michelle Dockery just nails this scene. And I also thought Jaeden Martell just nailed this scene because I felt like, once again, you could see him as being guilty or you could see him as being innocent. I feel like you could have two diametrically opposed views of Jacob in this scene. But what ultimately, just to me, was the crystallizing moment for the themes of this season was when Jacob goes to the hospital and sees Lori, and I think that this is different from the book. I have not read the book, but I read the Wikipedia summary, and Lori has amnesia and she can't remember what happened. And when Andy tells her that they've ruled that there was no foul play, when he tells her that, they don't think she tried to kill Jacob, she's like, oh, thank goodness. And you see the relief on her face because she was doubting, because she didn't know that she actually did do it for that reason. And she's like, what if when Jacob, who is alive, not dead as he was in the book, what if when he wakes up, he thinks that I tried to kill him? And this is the fascinating part, because she's always going to have to live with not knowing whether or not she actually tried to kill Jacob. And it seems like she had her entire memory wiped out. It seems like she doesn't remember what Andy told her in Mexico that led her to think that perhaps Jacob had done it, which opens up the question, what will she do if she actually ever remembers either of these two things? And to me, it's just the fascinating conundrum that the audience is in, and that has been throughout the show, is that you just don't know, and having to live with the inability to come to a certain knowledge of whether or not Jacob is guilty. And the episode ends, I think, in a really fitting way. And as I said, they didn't back away from the darkness here. Andy going home, he's all by himself. He goes up to his son's room, and you can kind of see him wishing things could just return to the way that they were before, which is another reason that this is a great episode to be titled After. And he's in the room in the darkness, just drinking, and this wonderful song choice is playing. I don't know the name of the song, but I'll be checking it out for sure, maybe adding it to my playlist. It was a great song choice. And then the darkness slowly engulfs Andy. And to me, what this scene was ultimately about was showing how Andy has said throughout the series he would do everything to protect his family. And at the end of the series, it seems like he may have succeeded, because it seems like Jacob may actually recover. The nurses were optimistic, according to Lori. And Lori has amnesia, and she can't even remember what she did to Jacob. But the darkness is swallowing Andy, which shows that even if he succeeded, it was at a terrible cost, and it may not have been worth it. And I think it's fascinating, because a lot of the time it was the keeping of secrets that did damage to Andy in this show. But here in this final episode, what caused everything to finally go south was when he told Lori the truth, because that was what led her doubt to return and her to try to kill Jacob. So to me, it's fascinating. I don't know that there was a lot of deep meaning in this show, but this episode was great. I think that it really just crystallized the themes for the show. This was just a great show, and I think the ending has made the whole season seem worth it. In fact, I'm not even sure if I feel like it should have been shorter now. I feel like that the development going back seems like it might have been worth it, because it made the suspense and the build up in this episode worth it. Now, did Jacob do it? I feel like the show wants you to admit that you don't know and that you feel comfortable not knowing. I am now finally leaning towards the he probably did it camp. But again, I feel like you have to be comfortable with not knowing. And I think that the only reason I'm in that camp is because the book clearly had him do it. And I think that maybe they changed the show because they wanted it to be a little bit more ambiguous. Maybe they felt that the book made it too easy for the viewer to assume that Jacob did it. But what do we really know in the end? And that is the question I think that the show leaves us with, is that we just have to live with the ambiguity of the situation. We have to live with all the things that we'll never know. So that's my thoughts on defending Jacob. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. You can subscribe now, and as always, you can watch more videos right now.